Hello and welcome to the seventh and final Women's Empowerment and in Development Lab, or WED Lab, seminar and webinar series. I'm Kate Grantham. I'm the coordinator of the WED Lab seminar series at McGill, and I'm so pleased to welcome those of you here in person today, as well as those of you who are online. So over the next 2 hours, we're going to be discussing state-of-the-art research and thinking on women's empowerment and entrepreneurship in the transition to low-carbon economies. Our diverse panel of experts from the worlds of international development research, policy, and practice will be discussing how to create and how to optimize decent work opportunities for women in lucrative, non-traditional fields such as the energy and natural resource sector, transportation services, and skilled construction that have remained inaccessible for women almost everywhere in the world. On our panel today, we have Bipasha Brewer, who is our facilitator coming from the University of Western Ontario. We have Françoise Duimana, from Global Affairs Canada. We have Laurent Jodoin from Econolay in Montreal, and we have Joanne Lebert from Impact. As well from Impact, we have Patience Singov. I'm so excited to have all of you here. Thank you so much for making the trips from near and from far and from much farther. So just to give you a sense of the way that our seminars and webinars tend to go in terms of format, we're going to have an opening presentation by our facilitator, Bipasha. We'll go for about 30 minutes. We'll then have an opportunity for audience Q&A, both here in the room as well as online. So if you're participating on Zoom, you can email your questions to me. My email is kathleen.grantham@mcgill.ca. It's there on the screen. I'll also put my email back up on the screen during the Q&A so you can send any questions that you have to me. After that, we'll have a 5-minute break and we'll move on then to our expert panel discussion. And after that, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions to all of our wonderful panelists. Right. So let's get started. It's my true pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today, Dr. Bipasha Brewer. She is the Canada Research Chair in Global Women's Issues and a tenured full professor in the Department of Women's Studies and Feminist Research at the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Brewer conducts interdisciplinary research on gender, development, and globalization, women and work, and social, political, and economic inequality. She serves frequently as an expert reviewer, consultant, and advisor to international development and environmental protection organizations. Dr. Brewer's current research focuses on climate change and social justice. It is aimed broadly at understanding how to ensure that a global low-carbon economy will be more gender equitable and socially just than its fossil fuel-based predecessor. Welcome, Bipasha.
Thank you. All right, shall I move to that? I think I can do it from here as long as I can move. Thanks very much for that wonderful introduction. So I titled my presentation today, Women's Empowerment and Entrepreneurship in the Transition to Low-Carbon Economies. And although I also talk about women's employment as opposed to entrepreneurship in low-carbon economies. So it's a bit of an interesting story how I began doing research on this topic. About 7 years ago, in 2012, I was at a conference at York University in Toronto. It was called Work in a Warming World. Very interesting. There were academics, there were people from industry, there were people from labor unions. And there was this particular slide. It was an information campaign that was being introduced by Blue Green Canada. And basically, the message was that if you invest $1 million in, into oil and gas, you get 2 jobs. You get 15 jobs if you invest it into clean energy, and that's terrific in and of itself. I love it. But as someone who's trained to think about equity issues, immediately I started having these questions in my head. What are those 15 jobs like? Are they full-time jobs? Are they part-time jobs? Are they precarious jobs? Are they jobs that have benefits? What kind of benefits? Who gets them, right? So I wasn't trying to undermine the overall message. I started asking these questions of Blue Green Canada, and it was very obvious that I was asking questions to which they frankly didn't have answers. So we know the big picture. We know that it creates more employment. We know that renewables are, at least presently, they are more labor intensive than capital intensive. Although in the future, as we get over kind of like the learning curve, as the technologies become more sophisticated, even that might change, and we might actually need, those technologies might be generating less employment. What I realized though was that this is not an area, it's not that people are not giving me information, it's that we don't have the information. So if I was going to find out about it, I would have to develop my own body of research on it. So that's when I began in 2012 with various funding. SHIRK funds it, the international energy agencies have funded it. There's a lot of interest in general in this topic, so it hasn't been a difficult topic to get off the ground. Around the same time, of course, the SDGs came into being in 2015. And there were two very clear goals that bring together both gender equality as well as the issue of clean energy. So it's goals 5 and 7. And it's very obvious that gender is an important consideration, both for energy access, because we know that there are gender dimensions to access, that women face specific challenges in accessing, in paying for example, energy. But there are also specific issues related to how, generally gender imbalanced the energy industry is globally. So it's very obvious that women also actually enjoy very few of the jobs in this sector, right? Hold very few of the jobs. So I needed to look at both, and that's kind of how my research evolved over time. I don't expect this panel to ask me this question, but I'm going to say it anyway. There are people who say, why do you care about whether women have employment in the energy sector? And I don't think that anyone in this audience is going to ask me that question. Well, I'll answer it all the same. One, there are very instrumental reasons. Increasingly the transition to low carbon economies means that we need a very diverse skill set. We need skill sets in business, in technology, in legal issues and economic issues. So we need to widen the talent pool. We need more people to participate. So for that reason alone, we need women to be involved because they're 50% of the population. And of course, we should also care about it because it's an issue of fairness and of justice and of equality. So there are moral as well as sort of what I would consider instrumental reasons for being interested. Around that point as well, I started noticing that IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency, publishes a jobs report every year. And in that jobs report, they make a real effort to also tell you about the number of jobs held by women. So that was very interesting for me. So if you look at those numbers, last year, 11 million jobs, and 32% of the jobs held by women. You can see the types of technologies that generate the most employment. So for example, solar PV, liquid biofuels. We also know a lot about the ones that rank higher. And we know fairly little about employment in geothermal in the ones that are at the bottom of that visual. So I started following their work quite closely as well. And then I would say that this was in 2017 or 2018. Someone from IRENA reached out to me and said, we've been following your research as well. And we were just wondering if you would be interested in helping us design this global survey, because we need more information. We need to know what kinds of roles are women playing in this sector, what kinds of challenges, what kinds of opportunities do they face? So it was one of those things where I had been doing this research to begin with, and they invited me to design the survey. So we were able to bring those interests together. So what we did, and this is just basically, it's Arana Data. It basically just tells you where the jobs are. And as you can see, I mean, like in terms of some countries, I mean, look at China, right? Look at so huge numbers, 4 million jobs, but tremendous potential in other parts of the world where you think there would be more potential, right? Like if you look at, for example, African countries, you realize that there's incredible potential, but we don't quite see those numbers yet, right? So what we did was we designed this survey, and it was published in the beginning of this year in 2019. So most of the work was done towards the end of last year, in the second half of last year. We designed this survey, and it was a global survey. We were trying to get information from as many countries, as many places as possible about what women were, what roles they were holding, challenges, opportunities. And we knew that this was going to be the biggest data set that was going to be available to people. So it was as open as possible. We did struggle quite a bit with definitional issues. So for example, we really wanted to capture developed as well as industrialized and developing. So how do you make sense of the world? We know that all of these definitions are like incredibly loaded and problematic to begin with, right? So what we did was we defined it as, first of all, we knew that we could only get formal jobs from doing this, right? It was a survey. People would have to go online to fill it out, whether it's an organization or an individual. So we knew that it kind of would not capture informal sector employment, and that's okay. We don't even know about the formal sector, so it was important to do this, right? Then in terms of definitions, not all renewables are clean, and we get that, right? So biomass, for example, is obviously not clean, but it's renewable, right? So we had to also think about those definitional issues, but we were interested in renewables. So let's go with renewables and see what we get globally. We had to kind of figure out a way of differentiating between different countries around the world. So we ended up with what we call the modern context. Now, the modern context doesn't just mean industrialized countries. It means countries where renewables will potentially displace or complement conventional energy. Okay, and we call the other one the energy access context, which means parts of the world where the primary concern is still actually expanding access to people, right? So where there may be a very modern energy sector available to people who are living in cities, who are typically better off, but there are also large segments of the population that don't have access or don't have reliable access. So we're trying to capture both, and we gave it those terms, like the modern sector, but with the understanding that what we were capturing here would be people who are working in formal jobs, regardless of where they're working, which sectors. So our distribution of survey, we got very good responses, I have to say, barring, the countries of what we would call the Commonwealth of Independent States, like the former Soviet Union, the former, that block, we didn't get any responses from. But other than that, I thought we did quite well with our responses. By region, very pleased with the responses from Africa. We could have done a little better, I think, on the Caribbean, but this being our first crack at doing something this global, we were actually quite pleased with the responses. So we got individuals as well as organizations. So you can fill out as an individual or as a representative of an organization. Now, before I move to this, one classification I'd like to make is when you study employment in this sector, it's very diverse. So for example, you can require extremely different levels of skill, level of training. You can receive very different kinds of compensation. As an example, the biomass sector, biofuels, a lot of the jobs are in the agricultural supply chain in that, right? So we're talking about often very low wages, informal work. On the other hand, if you're working in fuel processing, you're likely to need a much higher skill set and much better training. So we're trying to capture all of that. So say bioenergy has a very different profile from solar, from hydro, from geothermal, which tend to require different skills and different technologies. So what we found, first off, good news. We found that women were actually held up to 32% of jobs in the renewable energy sector, whereas they had only held 22% in the past, whereas they still only hold 22% in the oil and gas sector. So that's really good news. And this is the full-time workforce for women. Then, if we parse it down more, though, things get a little bit more depressing. So when you look at renewable energy, what we're finding is that STEM jobs are where we see the biggest gap, right, in the formal workforce. So 28% of women hold that. Non-STEM technical jobs are a little better. And then the rest, the bulk, actually comes from administrative work, right? So administrative, financial services, clerical services, public communication. So those are the ones that we see, the bulk of the employment in. So the gaps become more obvious, despite the average being not as depressing, perhaps. One interesting trend, and this is not from our survey, is that the patterns for STEM education are very counterintuitive, right? So this graph, it plots along the x-axis, it tells you the number of women with STEM graduates. The y tells you about gender equality. It's the gender equality index. So as you can see, Finland, Norway, terrific, right? Terrific findings for gender equality, but not at all impressive for levels of STEM education. On the other hand, look at the y-axis and look at, United Arab Emirates, Tunisia, Turkey, Algeria, not exactly countries that we think of as bastions for gender equality, but very high levels of graduation for women from STEM fields. Mind you, this is a graph that depicts education, not employment. So the challenges might be very different once you finish your education and you're looking for employment. Then in the middle, we have what I would say the fallout, what I would say are some of the continued effects of good effects actually of central planning in the former kind of like the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. And I tend to say, I mean, even now, the highest levels of STEM training, when you look at for women, Russia, the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania still do very, very well, which of course doesn't mean that I'm endorsing a return to Soviet-style central planning. But what it does tell us, though, is that very strong state involvement in designing equality policy does work, and I think that we may have, in some ways, we may have thrown out kind of the baby with some of the bathwater. We could have retained some lessons, I think, from that. That's all I'm willing to say in this. Canada does equally poorly. The big goal for engineering right now is 30 by 30. 30% by the year 2030, whereas many developing countries have far, far exceeded that. So our surveys, these were very interesting findings. One, the people who responded, 69% were women. So you send out a survey about gender and about gender equality, you know who's going to respond, right? Of individual respondents, not that surprising, right? The top is very interesting. So we found that whereas, and this is from it's sort of like the modern context, that 75% of women said that they experience barriers in the energy sector. Only 40% of men thought that women experience barriers, okay? So that's very interesting. The same, 60% of men on the left, and only 60% of men believe that men and women were paid equally, right? But only 29% of women believe that, okay? So perception is not reality. We didn't actually figure out whether they are being paid equally, but I think that the perceptions of barriers is extremely important for what, because they often can be, they do. There's a reason why people perceive barriers. Now combine this information with what boards look like, what the highest levels of representation are dismal. And often they're dismal for women because training in STEM, having had engineering experience, having had experience in operations and maintenance, for example, O&M functions, operations, those are considered stepping stones for being promoted up to the highest levels. If you don't have that, then you're not going to make it to that top level for boards. So often on boards, you'll see the only female representative is like coming from a human resource background. Right? That tends to be very common for boards when you look at this sector. And you can tell the numbers are not at all impressive. And this is from the world's largest utilities in 2016. And when we broke it down by sector, we were not that pleased either, because say, for example, you really want to see 51 to 74%, would be terrific if they were women. But the only, you basically, in NGOs, we were basically able to find that perhaps, 14% have that representation. And NGOs, okay, 27% even have 75 to 100% women, right? But the others, just look at the numbers. For government, for private sector, the numbers at that level tend to be, the farther right you go, tend to be quite demoralizing for women. Canada does horribly on this, and I just have to show it because publicly traded energy companies in Canada, this is actually shocking. So 6% are women on boards, 94% are men. Now get this, okay? Of that 94%, almost 12%, in other words, twice the number of women have first names John, David, or Robert. So I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions from that one, but this is what it looks like. And often, like I follow boards very closely, they've literally added one woman, and you see kind of the percentages can be very, very deceptive, right? Because the numbers are so low to begin with. We see this across the board. So then, what kinds of things did people tell us? Well, barriers to entry. And this is the people who hold formal jobs in a formal, modern energy sector, right? So those were the top three. In terms of for entry into the sector, they said perceptions of gender norms were huge, cultural and social norms were huge, and prevailing hiring practices. So the feedback we got was this was not a sector, in a way, the jobs were not designed for from women to begin with. So when hiring managers, they don't find you suitable because they were not. So because the way that they've been designed, the way they perceive you when you enter, you just don't make that cut. Basically, we heard that often. And then advancement. So then what happens once you get in? What prevents you from, going from climbing? And essentially, we got, limited mobility often was as a result of family obligations, that women were less mobile. Lack of training, childcare, discouraging workplace practices. So it was often kind of, we heard a lot of the, like a 1,000 paper cuts as opposed to one major thing that drove you away, right? So, and you're like, well, I have all these skills, I can go somewhere else. Why do I need to be in this industry? Is what happened quite a lot. Then moving away, we looked at in the, as you can tell from that figure, it says the energy access context. So these are now countries where we're still struggling. There may be a modern energy sector, of course, but we're still struggling with getting access to large numbers of people. So who were the respondents and what were they working in? We found that 39% of the respondents were working on things like solar home systems, biodigesters, mini grids, 24%, which I was actually quite impressed with, the mini grid number, and then clean cooking solutions, which we expected that it would be quite enormous, right? So we saw a big organizational size, typically small organizations. If you look at that chart, only 10% have more than 1,000 employees, right? So most of them, 39%, 40%, have fewer than 20 employees, which is, small organizations essentially in that sense. Those are the major responses. This is very interesting. So this is where we get slightly counterintuitive findings, which I think are super interesting. In the energy access context, where there is still, potential for energy to be, for people who don't have basic access, large segments of the population, there actually fewer women perceived cultural and social norms as a barrier, right? So if you look at 66%, whereas in the modern context, 70, 75%, I think, said that they were major barriers. So if you look at the colors, if you look at, North America, for example, the average was 72%, but 75% in North America and Europe said cultural and social norms, which is quite interesting, right? What they did tell us very clearly is, if you look at the third one, lack of skills, very clearly we found that African women, in Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, they told us, what's your greatest need? Well, skills. We need skills. That's our biggest problem. The others, not as much, which doesn't mean that the others are not issues, of course. I want to be very careful, right? What it just means is that their topmost priority right now is getting skills and getting training, right? So that's kind of very, very obvious. So if I slice this in a slightly different way, same thing basically, but what we found was that we said, what kinds of things would help you? We asked in the modern energy context, for example, like we just said, what kinds of things for women working in formal jobs in the energy sector, regardless of where you're placed, whether you're in the modern context or whether you're working in an emerging economy or a developing country, what would help you most? Training again. You look at the training chart and look at Africa, followed by Asia Pacific, followed by Latin America, and then North America. Other things like networking, they were valued, but not as much. So it's a very clear, pointy tip there with training for Africa, for example, was recognized quite often. And other things, there were things like job sharing. They said it would be helpful if you could do that to create more flexibility in the future where jobs can be shared between two people. We can have alternative arrangements work. That's what they're trying to tell us, right? Like, alternative work arrangements would also be helpful in various forms. Generally, though, we found that these, in the energy access context, meaning mostly developing countries and emerging economies, we found the biggest need was training and skills. Followed, definitely, financing is really important. Integrating a gender perspective into energy is really important. And also just awareness raising about, renewables to begin with. Right? That there was still a lot of work to be done, that this was possible. So having that conversation about, leapfrogging, I see it all the time, how we'll move into like these futures, there's still a lot of awareness raising even that needs to be done about these technologies, because there definitely people don't know about them. So I want to now move us just, through to our the questions about distributed renewable energy projects. So this is what, the biggest share in emerging economies and developing countries. From a development perspective, what we're interested in is off-grid and distributed renewable energy, right? So first of all, we need to look at, there's so many different things to look at. We need to look at direct, indirect, formal, informal, and data is really sparse. It's very hard to do this research for that reason, because you're trying to craft a narrative out of bits and pieces of things. So I remember a student at a workshop asked me to explain her methodology, and I kind of said it's kind of like a vacuum cleaner methodology. Like, I try and find what I can and I try to analyze it. And it's not because I don't want it to sound more sophisticated, but that it's very hard to do research on this topic, right? We also have some numbers. We know now that approximately 130 million off-grid solar lanterns, solar home systems, that's SHS, and other products have been sold worldwide by 2017. So that's a pretty big number. We know that estimated direct employment in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia together was estimated to be about 372,000 full-time equivalent jobs. It's still very small. Think about the potential, right? And of these, we found that about 27% are in, it's not surprising that they're in rural areas. That's where the big need tends to be for not having access to energy. And 27% about are filled by women. 7% of households said, in terms of just the indirect effects, the induced effects, because having access to a reliable source of energy itself can enable you to take on a job because it frees you up, right? So it has dramatic impacts often upon women's ability to participate in economic activities, because you're not doing the laborious stuff, you're not picking up firewood anymore, you're not doing that. So we found, for example, that 7% of households saying that owning a solar home system literally enabled a family member to take on a new job, which is quite impressive. We found that 44% of households, again, SHS will give you more time to work, and 24% of households use that energy generated in an income generating activity. So whatever it is that you're doing, there are many things that it makes possible, right? When you have a reliable source of, an affordable source of energy at home. Now the big challenge for us is that the direct or the indirect formal jobs are literally the tip of the iceberg, right? And we couldn't capture. It's very obvious that we didn't get to, all the informal jobs. That's because the numbers are so staggering. And we know that they're major drivers of the economy. I've, studied informal economies for a long time, and they're enormous, right? We're talking about when 80%, 85%, 90% of a country's employment is informal. That's not like a marginal economy. We're talking, that is the economy in some cases. So we know very less about those aspects. So key findings, I'll try and summarize for women's entrepreneurship specifically. We found that, yes, under supportive conditions, we found that entrepreneurship can really can contribute very well to increasing income generating opportunities and enhancing social status. Having said that, we found that there is a really dramatic need for training and mentoring programs, focusing on technical, financial, and leadership skills, because increasingly, these are sectors that this is such a non-traditional sector for women that without those components, it's a very difficult one for women to figure out by themselves to enter, right? So those things are absolutely crucial, so people can identify new business opportunities, can identify networks, know which networks work for them, and then can develop market strategies, things like that, right? So it's very, very important. Access to finance was absolutely huge. 56% of respondents said that is a huge problem for us, is that we don't have suitable finance for developing small and medium enterprises in this sector, in the energy sector, right? Mentoring programs are also necessary, not just to introduce women to like the mode of work in this industry, but because it's so non-traditional. It's something that in every part of the world where men have typically worked in this sector, in the energy sector. So it's necessary for breaking down barriers for all of those reasons as well, because in terms of sociocultural perception, stereotypes, all of that. So in terms of findings, other findings, so what are the factors that prevent women from accessing financing? Because the numbers are stark. We found, like in Kenya, for example, 48% of business owners, small business owners, are women. Only 7% have access to formal credit, right? For women. So what's going on there? And we said it's a variety of things. One, obviously, often the poorer a person is, you don't have assets, you don't have collateral. So how are you going to get financing? There's very limited awareness of financial schemes. So even where financial schemes exist, and they may exist, you may not be aware of them. So that's a big challenge, is how do you communicate? Because often information about financial schemes are appearing, say, in newspapers, for example, right? Which has very limited circulation and people may not know. Bankers, we found, knew very little. Often bankers were a huge challenge. They don't know about renewable energy. They don't know about the sector itself. They don't have confidence in the sector. They're like, how is this going to work? You're going to be selling solar lanterns? What? Right? So they don't know about the sector. And then they also don't have confidence because of gender biases. They don't have confidence in something that is going to be led by women, obviously, right? So women-led enterprises. And then confidence issues for sure, especially conducting financial transactions, because these are not sectors that you can just, it's not something that women have a high comfort level with. It's not something that you've done for a long time and you can walk in and start negotiating. So we found those to be big limitations. So there's a very strong need for inclusive financing channels that are kind of accessible for women. Some solutions are emerging. So I read some interesting things, like in Kenya, women who got really sick and tired of not being turned down for credit, they decided basically to start this crowdfunding initiative, which I thought was tremendous and very, very interesting. So basically, they actually figured out a crowdfunding platforms utilizing mobile payments. So things like, M-Pesa, very, very helpful for women to be able to figure out different kinds of ideas. But despite some success, I would say it's still a huge barrier. The financing is still absolutely an enormous barrier. Other things, lack of skills. We can't get around it anymore because this is a sector that increasingly the distributed renewable energy sector needs 2/3 of its workforce to be skilled. So there's actually very little room within the sector for people to not be skilled, right? So, it's an increasingly skilled sector and we can't pretend that, large groups of people have those skills. They don't, to work in them, right? What kinds of skills am I talking about? Well, technical skills, so installation, operations and maintenance, products standards, quality control, business related. How do you do accounting, bookkeeping, product design, pricing, business plans, things like that. And then marketing skills, because these are new technologies. If you go approach somebody and say, I want you to buy a solar home system for your household, why would they when they've had an alternative, even though it may be something that is very expensive for them, maybe very bad for the environment, but why would they, right? So there is a skill required in explaining these technologies. You need good marketing skills. Then we found, because it's such a non-traditional skills, a sector, leadership training, and things like digital literacy. There's no avoiding that. I mean, women, you need access to those things. The only reason those women were able to get on that funding platform was because they knew how to handle M-Pesa, right? So that's necessary, and that's very specifically in Kenya. We found that training that combines finance and business training is more effective than just finance or business. So they do have to be provided together as opposed to separately. And finally, I'll wrap up with just limiting. How am I doing for time? Am I okay?
You're good. You've got
okay.
Yeah, got like 5 more minutes.
Awesome. Yeah. Perfect. I have a lot to say, and it's one of those things where you've worked on a topic for a long time and you're trying to get as much out there as possible, knowing that you won't be able to do all of it justice. So, definitely look forward to questions as well. Limiting factors, finally, I think it's really hard to avoid these questions. One, entrepreneurship is simply not a realistic livelihood strategy for many women. The poorer the woman, the poorer the person, the less likely they are to be able to consider this as a livelihood strategy. That makes perfect sense. We get that, right? And often very well-intentioned and well-designed interventions will fail to convince people to become entrepreneurs. So I looked at projects in India, for example, where there's no initial investment for the entrepreneur. You can actually get that financing to be able to, for example, to be able to work on like renting solar lanterns to families as a source of income. What prevented women often from doing it, their homes are not big enough. They have very, very small homes, and you do need some space within your home to be able to store these products. You need a tin roof on which you can actually, so that you can charge your, you can set up the solar panels. They don't have tin roofs, right? So there are structural factors that prevent people even from joining, even when the initiatives themselves are very well designed and well intentioned. Poor women generally are very averse to entrepreneurship. A, they have no capital to invest, they have no collateral to borrow, and they have a morbid fear of debt, as they should. Debt has a very long and miserable history, right, among poor people. So they tend to be much more interested, and this is global, actually. This is not just, developing countries, industrialized countries. I found this to be true everywhere. Poor women everywhere in the world are much more interested in stable wage employment than in entrepreneurship. I was in Finland recently, and I spoke with someone who is from Slovenia, and she said, we're so tired of this because we have Western Europe kind of has this very paternalistic attitude towards Central Europe, where they're encouraging women to become entrepreneurs, the same kind of narrative. They're like, we're not interested. Poor women want jobs. They want good jobs, right? So please stop talking to us about entrepreneurship. So I think it's a very interesting lesson, and pretty much a global one. So acquiring new skills, especially new skills with which you can earn an income, I think that's what poor women are much more interested in. So learning how to build, learning how to repair technologies. So some things like the Barefoot College, the model that they developed, those are really important. And they're often much better suited to people's economic realities and their limitations. To be fair, increasingly we are seeing organizations that are trying to do that. So we're seeing, private sector organizations, social enterprises, NGOs, even governments, they're trying to create livelihood opportunities outside of that entrepreneurial sphere, right? Where people are learning things like that. So sometimes, you can also do education and awareness about these technologies, about the benefits of adopting these technologies, teaching women how to do, for example, energy audits of homes, of small businesses. They can do that for a fee. So those are often actually better skills for women to acquire. Few examples of organizations that I think are doing quite well in this area. TIDE is Technology Informatics Development Endeavor. I think that's what the TIDE stands for. It's a social enterprise in India, and they teach women, often they train women to do these very practical things like to build clean cook stoves out of locally available materials. You can build and you can repair, right? So that's a very good skill. And often these are women who might have been working in very, very strenuous manual labor that was extremely poorly paid. Now they're able to actually increase their livelihoods by often earning 2 or 3 times more than they were before. We were also seeing Selco India, similar type of model where they develop, it's not purely entrepreneurial. They encourage people to kind of learn skills that can earn them livings, right? EnviroFit, the same way, they're all over, actually. They're in Asia and Africa and Latin America, typically improved cook stoves. And what they do is they also pay on a commission basis, where they send people out into communities to talk about these technologies. And if you can succeed people in convincing, if people buy them, then they earn a commission, for example. So things like that don't necessarily require you to borrow money or have upfront capital. Those tend to be much better. What I'm seeing, though, our evidence suggests that these are good things, but what we're finding is that the incomes are really low and they're very precarious. So it's not like these are stable livelihoods for women, for anyone. So I'll just end by saying that I think any conversation about this, any conversation about employment in the sector, entrepreneurship, we have to talk about complementing efforts to expand social security and protection. There's no getting around it. So if that existed, if people weren't so worried about, if people had a basic income, if people had healthcare, if they had other forms of protection, then these, in complement with that, I think these industries can do a lot of good. But I really think we can't avoid not talking about that piece. The good news, though, is that more countries in the global south are transitioning towards developing welfare systems. So this is very interesting that around the world now we're seeing examples from around the world of introducing things like basic income schemes. So we see them in many countries now. I'm seeing basic income schemes from Mexico, from Brazil, from Chile, from India. So they're trying to introduce the idea of basic income schemes. It's almost embarrassing that it's happening in the reverse context in industrialized countries where we introduce them and then get rid of them and say these are not feasible, right? Like which they are. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that shows that they work very well. Finland had one for I think the results are just coming in. They did it for 2 years and the amounts were really low. It was 500 euros a month, I think. And the findings show that although it didn't enable people to go and find employment right away because of the peace of mind, what it did for improving health, reducing levels of stress, absolutely dramatic. The findings are absolutely dramatic, right? So we need to think about more things like that. Cash transfer programs, some of them are conditional, but you have to do some things like your kid has to be registered at school, your kid has to be vaccinated for you to receive a certain amount, and others are unconditional, which means that you can have that amount regardless of whether you're doing those things, which most people will do anyway. I think there's so much middle class bias in these things where we assume that if you give people a certain amount of money, somehow they're going to run out and buy, I don't know, alcohol and cocaine. It's not enough. Frankly, it's not enough to do those things, first of all. And people spend on things that matter to them the most, which is typically caring for themselves, basic needs, and their families, right? So I think the fact that we are seeing these develop in many contexts, and I don't just mean in industrialized countries, is a very positive development for the future. So I would like to end on that positive note, that I hope that in the future, we live in a world where actually social protection, perhaps, in my opinion, should be completely delinked, should be provided within a human rights framework, and should be completely delinked from employment status. When I say this in some settings, people call me a Marxist, and that's okay. I've been called a lot worse, so I'm fine with being called a Marxist. So I'll end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Terrific. Thanks so much, Bipasha. That's fantastic and really interesting to see kind of what's come out of this, one of the largest and only data sets looking at this issue. So thanks for sharing that very current research with us. We're going to turn now for a couple minutes of Q&A with the audience here in the room, as well as online. I think I saw some activity happening in the chat, and then I tried to check it on my phone, and there was this really weird echo that happened in the room, so I haven't been able to. But if you are participating online and you want to ask a question, I'm checking my email now, so you can just email me. My address is there. Turning to those in the room momentarily, are there any immediate questions about the presentation that you just heard? I know I have one, but I want to give others a chance. Yeah, just turn on your microphone as well.
Yeah, just a quick question about the survey. So what was the response rate, and do you have a sense of who didn't respond to the survey?
We actually also published the methodology, so it is included in the methodology. Yeah. I would have to look it up. Yeah, we've just published it, but I imagine it was fairly high as well. But what we were surprised was because it was Arana, so this is the International Renewable Energy Agency, they have a big convening role, right, in the energy sector. So it would have been impossible for me to run something like this by myself. So that collaboration was terrific because it meant that it was sent out. I mean, it was coming to me through various networks. It was funny, right? Like when that survey was being sent to me to fill out. So it's going out. It went out through anything we could think of, women's advocacy groups, NGOs, government. So we sent it. So their network was terrific for helping us get a fairly high response rate.
Excellent. Thanks.
And we did publish the methodology in its entirety in the report because we want people to be able to benefit from the methodology as well. Because the same idea, you could, there's a lot of interest now, for example, in finding out the status of women in the context, in transportation, in the sector, especially in the context of automation, artificial intelligence, right? So a similar model can be used to generate, a very large global data set. And while it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, it gives you something to build on, right? For future research to build on.
No, that's great.
Yeah, thanks. And I see we have a question in the room.
Thanks, Kate. Actually, I was just, because I'm looking at the survey right now, it's quite impressive. I'll just quote the stats. 1,400 respondents to the Arana Agenda survey, 1,100 responses from individuals, 285 responses from organizations, and 144 countries represented in the survey. So
I knew those stats, but the non-response rate, I'm not sure if we published it. I'll try and look it up for you.
It was just out of curiosity, just because I'm a data person. So.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. I was thinking currently with the new Canadian government and also the new EU Commission, there's a lot of focus on energy, like clean energy and environment overall. So I'm curious about what would you say that to these institutions and governmental policies that you would like to see if there's anything that could be done.
I mean, I think I highlighted some of them already, and I actually worked most of this year. I was with the International Energy Agency. I was on sabbatical and did a secondment with them, preparing actually a status of women report for the energy sector, because again, there's so much interest in the topic in general. I would say that the things that I highlighted, putting money into skills, putting money into training skills, huge, you know, trying to figure out more innovative ways of financing, of providing financing. I think those are really, really, really important. It's very difficult for, you know, donor organizations or you know, to get involved in social protection schemes. I get that, right? But I think there's still so much else that can be done in terms of providing really high quality training and skills, and being aware of gender. Being aware, because it's not that there aren't great training facilities, it's not that there aren't great training institutes, but often the approach they take, like there's no attention paid to the fact that that not everyone can access those trainings, you know, those facilities, those institutions at par. So I think paying attention to things like cost, to you know, to the cost of these programs, trying to make them as inexpensive as possible is really huge. The other big one that I always recommend is when you looked at that map of STEM training, right? I'm really astonished by how much talent goes to waste of women who are already highly skilled in STEM fields in many sort of non-Western contexts and countries, because the big gap there is not for education. They're already graduating with the STEM degrees. It's finding employment and then staying employed, right? So I think there is real potential to support those groups of women, to support kind of, you know, educated middle-class women who already have very high levels of training in these fields and can be absolutely terrific in the field.
Great. Yes, please use your microphone.
How about the social barriers? If you take, for instance, you were mentioning that in Canada, the STEM rate is really low. There's not that many girls going into those fields. You were mentioning that in other countries where there's, I mean, that gender balance is not there, there's a lot of women going into it. So if we take a Canada where girls don't go into that kind of training, and maybe the developing countries where they don't go into that type of training either, if you take middle income countries instead of just the poor of the poorest, what would be the barriers that would be similar that could be worked on?
It's a complicated question, and I've thought about it a lot, because the findings are so interesting and you kind of wonder what's going on. There are multiple explanations. They resonate kind of partially with me. Some of them I think, yeah, I can see how that can be true. Others I'm not fully accepting of what's going on, right? So one thing that shows up quite easily, I think, is that countries where there is, for example, we see in that graph I showed, we don't have to pull it up, but you remember the graph I showed, right? So you saw very high levels of STEM education, like Oman, you know, like 56% of engineers are women, right? Malaysia, like, so there are some countries that show very high levels of STEM educational attainment for women, right? So there's one block there of those countries. I think a lot of them tend to be countries in the Middle East, tend to be often like UAE, Turkey, we see that. And then in the middle block, we see a lot of countries that were part of the former, maybe not part of the former Soviet Union, but part of the sphere of influence, right? Let's put it that way. Like Eastern Europe, we see very high numbers. And then as you move more into like the social democracies, into more of like the Western, you know, democracies, the rates really go down, right? So we're kind of wondering, here women have way more freedom to choose and pick and all that. So what's going on? Why has Finland never been able to produce more than 20%, you know, female engineers? Like, whereas Oman produces 56%. Like, what's going on with that? I think one explanation is that, first of all, there's a lot that needs to be done in these sectors to make them interesting and welcoming for women. Like I'm at Western University, University of Western Ontario, and one of my classes I teach in an engineering building that still, I kid you not, has like 3 bathroom stalls for women in the entire building. You'd hate the building, remember? Yes, yeah. So there's still a lot that needs to be done to make, you know, it was assumed that there were no women in that building, right? So so there are things, those things need to catch up for sure. There is also, I really believe that more so in industrialized countries, I think the professional community in STEM is not doing a very good job of getting the message across that these are fields that are incredibly important. They always just focus on pay, right? This is very high paid, very well paid sectors. This is, but they're not challenging the message that these are not fields that are completely socially isolating, that only geeks go into. So I think there's a lot of that work that needs to be done, right? Whereas in countries where women have all kinds of other barriers to studying these fields, but they know that having a STEM degree gives them much higher status in society. So it becomes a bargaining chip. Does that make sense? Because having a STEM degree, having an engineering degree almost gives you honorary male status, if that makes sense. So you're more likely to aspire to it in settings where, frankly, other things may not be terrific for you as a woman. That's an explanation that resonates a little bit for me, but even that, again, is a partial explanation. So there's a lot on it, but I think those are the explanations I've most looked at, and parts of them resonate with me.
Just a follow-up question on that point specifically. I remember reading or learning some time ago, and this could be completely incorrect, but that, for example, in former communist or socialist countries, you had a lot more women who were medical doctors than in other countries. And the explanation that was given was that the status and the salaries were not considered as high as in other countries, but status as well. So they were essentially going or more numerous in sectors where the status was not as high relative to what like a doctor's status would be in a place like Canada, for instance. And so I wonder if that overlaid onto this played a role as well.
Absolutely, it well might, actually. It well might. I think because the same way, right? Like increasingly, the other explanation that I've seen for countries of the former Soviet Union is that while there weren't terrific social support systems, there were social support systems for people, right? You may not like the house you live in, but you have a house. You may not like the childcare you get, but you do have childcare for women. And that is like absolutely government provided. So there were these things that made it possible for women to succeed in certain fields that over time, the trend even in those countries is that with every year, you're seeing the numbers going down, right? So that explains it. And I think that does provide somewhat of an explanation that when you take away those kinds of supporting things that made it possible for people to succeed, then you don't see the benefits of being in those fields anymore. So you see lower numbers. Absolutely.
Great. I'm just going to turn quickly to two comments online. One is from Anne Shalesh. She's a friend and colleague of mine, actually. And she says, really interesting research. I'm happy to hear that some women can still navigate the barrier of access to finance for RE projects through technologies like M-Pesa in Kenya. My observation as a Kenyan is that such projects have been tied to resolving the essentials, like a need for healthy and affordable energy, and thus people find it important. The second question comes from Kais Irani. And they ask, you talked about the world as a whole. Could you say anything specific about less developed countries where you may have found the challenges could be different?
Okay. The second question, I think, right? The first, basically, she said it's great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, no, I completely agree that even the use of things like M-Pesa, which has exploded, right? And it's very prevalent in Kenya. And I think it offers real new possibilities, right? Like for women. So, and obviously women who've already been entrepreneurs working in the sector, they're savvy enough to know how to use it, right? So we need more of that. We need more of that. We need those benefits to spread. It's a good question. I'm not sure I'm answering it, but I'll take a crack. I think we didn't necessarily, like I mentioned, it was very difficult, doing kind of some of the framing and defining of this survey because of this research, because, you really can't divide the world into kind of like developing anymore, because we know that there are huge pockets of poverty within industrialized countries. We know that there's immense, wealth within developing countries. And even access to infrastructure is dramatically different depending on what social strata you belong to, even in many of these countries. So that made it really, really challenging. What I was disappointed with is that I felt as if we know very little actually about Central Europe, for example. I felt as if we didn't get any information, and it's just by chance that I happened to have conversations with researchers who've told me a little bit about the situation in those countries. And I feel as if there is, even in, for example, the context of sub-Saharan Africa, I would say most of the innovation, most of the activity, I would say is limited to about 5 to 7 countries, right? So we're seeing it much more in the more kind of like the advanced economies in sub-Saharan African countries. So you're seeing a lot of innovations coming out of like South Africa, Kenya is a big one, Ghana, you know, so we're seeing some countries we're seeing you know, much more on. So that's kind of the best I think I can tell you. And I can only guess that the challenges are obviously more immense in other settings that are poorer.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who joined in online for the Q&A and in person. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 2 p.m. and we'll get into our panel discussion. Thank you. Okay, everyone, welcome back. I'm very excited to introduce the esteemed members of our panel for today. First, we have Françoise Duimana, who is Deputy Director with MGS, the Gender Equality Division at Global Affairs Canada, where she is responsible for Africa and Middle East. She has more than 20 years of experience in the field of gender equality and women's empowerment. Beyond her work at GAC, she has also worked with UNDP, the Pearson Peacekeeping Center, and as a gender consultant for numerous UN organs. She has published and contributed to a multitude of studies related to gender and women, peace and security, with a particular focus on Africa. As well, we have Laurent Jodoin, holding a PhD from the University of Paris 1 and the University of Montreal, summa cum laude. Laurent Jodoin has 15 years experience working in sustainable development research and project management. He's currently working at Econolé and is the principal investigator of a research project with IDRC aimed at improving energy justice for women in sub-Saharan Africa. As well, we have Joanne Lebert. Joanne is Executive Director of Impact and leads their work to improve how natural resources are managed where security and human rights are at risk. Joanne is a policy advisor, frequent guest speaker, and trainer to policymakers, private sector representatives, and civil society organizations. Previously, Joanne was based at the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Center, where she focused on gender-based violence in conflict settings in Africa and how it has impacted the extractives industry, or by the extractives industry. She was also Deputy Director of the Canadian nonprofit Peacebuild, where she worked to strengthen Canadian foreign policy options and practice. Also here from Impact, we have Patience Singo, who is Impact's technical expert on artisanal and small-scale gold mining. He advises on and implements technical assistance for the Just Gold project. He also assists with Impact strategies to improve governance systems, including mercury reduction and addressing other environmental impacts of artisanal and small-scale gold mining. Patience has a wealth of experience in project management, government, and stakeholder engagement, as well as a vast technical knowledge specific to mining. Patience worked for nearly a decade as project director for a sustainable artisanal mining project with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation in Mongolia, and was previously a technical advisor to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization's global project to reduce mercury in ASGM. So we have a wide range of expertise coming from different perspectives. We have research, we have practice, we have policy. I'm so happy that each of you are here with us today. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your insights. I'm going to hand it back over now to Bipasha to facilitate our discussion. The questions have been provided to our panelists in advance. We have 3 of them, and we're going to chat for the next 45 minutes or so.
Kate, I'm so interested in hearing from everyone on the panel because although I have other research projects that look at sectors like construction, transportation, manufacturing. Most of my expertise is limited to the energy sector, and I really want to hear how the things that I think about and talk about play out in the jobs that you do and sort of the experiences that you have and the perspectives that you bring to this panel. So let me start with basically the first question, and can I start with you, Françoise? Okay. So essentially, just if you could just give us a sense of how working with implementing gender and women's economic empowerment, and what kinds of changes you've seen in light of this recent kind of like transition to low carbon economies.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I think you have raised most important questions and challenges. I agree with all of your points. I would like to focus more on Africa because this is the region I've been covering, and just provide you with a bit more description of what is the situation when we talk about climate change, and particularly green economy in Africa. So you have on one side 40% of the population with any access to clean water, and you have 60% of population without any access to clean energy. And you know what is the gender division look like in Africa. So think about the burden that is fed on women to feed, to seek, to carry water and everything that the society needs to function. And then on the other side, you have these gaps you have been flagging in terms of knowledge, training, technologies. 30% of women in STEM. I think it's not lower than the average at the world level, but as you said, it's not sure that once those women have graduated, they get the job that they deserve. It's a gap that we need to look at. When it comes to, I'm happy you flag this mobile money as a technology. However, 23% of women, less like men, own a mobile phone. So there is a gap, a huge gap in that area. When it comes to internet, you have a gap about 45%. So think of those aspects and the way they affect women who would like to be entrepreneur, who maybe have the capacity, the skill, but they don't have the facilities and the technologies. And one last statistic, I think, which is really important, we just discussed informally during the break. It's not true that we don't have an interesting percentage of women in entrepreneur in Africa. They are really by nature entrepreneur because they've been naturally working to feed the family, to find solutions to every problem. So the data that I have actually is, talked about 50% of this SME, which will be held by women, but without those supportive mechanisms, access to finance, formal registration, and so and so. So these are the challenges we are trying to fix working on Africa. When we fund, we want to invest more in climate change, we have this gender analysis of, disparities, inequalities, but the systemic barriers, the social norms, and we make sure that we are really promoting women's access, equal access and control through skills. You pointed the key point, really, skills. Let's talk about human capital, because the state of the situation right now clearly demonstrates that we need to do more to encourage more girls to go to STEMs, but not only for them to complete the education, create a mentoring system or some new specific measures that will help them accessing to good and sustainable employment. So in summary, these are key questions we are trying to fix when we are funding initiative, and I would be happy to share more after the tour de table, what types of projects we are supporting to really fill this gap and empower women.
All right. Can I move ahead? Oh, sorry. Can I actually, in the order that the panelists are presented, may I ask you, Laurent, how you think about especially gender in your work? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Bipasha, for your very interesting presentation, and thank you, Kathleen, for inviting me. Well, I think that we can help each other, Bipasha, because from what I heard, You make a very comprehensive survey around the world, but more specifically to, I would say, maybe middle income jobs in the energy sector. And we did recently in 2019 this survey in sub-Saharan Africa in rural areas in 2,000 households. And so the challenges are quite similar, but at the same time different. So what I see first is that, well, I share your concern about the data being sparse, of course. It's very difficult. And we face a lot of challenges also, as you can imagine, in rural areas. Just for instance, there's a lot of families that are polygamous. So when you have to survey this family, how do you choose the woman who will be responding to the survey? And that was a big challenge even among African researchers. So anyway, what I see is this is two different, I would say, energy interventions. The first one is about, and this is known for quite a while, I mean, for improved cook stove. Because there's, from our survey, we've seen that about 80% of households still use 3-stone cook stove. And well, first of all, there's been a lot of I would say sensitization campaign for improved cook stove, but it didn't work. And if you can have programs that can help household and women in particular to use this kind of cook stove, I think that you can have some kind of a virtuous circle. It means less indoor pollution, air pollution. It means more spare time. It means that they won't face a lot of physical aggression when they go for collecting woods, because we did also a lot of interviews in focus group, and that's what we notice. Also, it can also mean that these women will be able to have more time for socialization, more opportunity for productive activity, and so on. So this is the first energy intervention that I see from our survey and, well, the preliminary analysis that we did. And the second one is about electricity. So this is quite separated, because most of the time when we do energy efficiency interventions or programs, we focus, of course, on electricity and renewable energy. But what we see is that sometimes we increase instead of decreasing the energy inequalities. Because, of course, if you just use one light bulb and a 3-stone cook stove, what do you do with energy efficiency intervention? So this second one should be focused on renewable energy, decentralized renewable energy, and make sure that, for instance, solar PV panels are reliable, because most of the time they come from the black market and they can do anything with it. So yeah, and the last point I want to make is from another project that we did in Ghana 2 years ago. And of course, we knew that there's not a lot of women in STEM. And the project was to improve the energy efficiency sector in Ghana. And so there was energy audits, and we had to choose 2 buildings to be audited and to benefit from retrofitting. So we chose an office building because that's what the beneficiary wanted. But we choose a high school girl to install a solar panel. And what we did is we installed those panels, and we teach those young girls how to maintenance the solar panels. And so well, we don't know for sure because we should go back and see for ourselves. But I think that we gave them a head start in comparison to the male colleague. And the other thing is that we ask a woman engineers to come in the school and share her experience, because obviously she succeeded in her work. And this is something, because what I saw in your survey is that some women were complaining about the lack of mentoring in their job. So that could be a part of the solution.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very eager to hear about the mining sector. I've been waiting for this all day. So
Wow.
whoever wants to go first,
Joanne,
our patient. So can I start with you, Joanne?
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to say a few words, and then I'm going to pass it to patients. So I'm just going to very briefly say who we are. We're a non-governmental organization. We're called Impact, obviously. We were previously called Partnership Africa Canada. We've existed for 33 years, and we work on natural resource governance, particularly in conflict-affected areas. So when I talk about natural resource management, I'm speaking about mineral wealth in particular. And the international attention that was drawn to the role of the rough trade in diamonds as links to conflict, that was us in our report in the late 90s that led to the international mobilization around blood diamonds and the formation of the Kimberley process, which we left 2 years ago because it's completely dysfunctional. That's a different presentation. But we also work on conflict minerals, so gold and what's called 3Ts, so things that we find in our electronic products and other consumables. And patients will be talking about cobalt as links to the green economy, essentially. So what's at the bottom there? I guess fundamentally it's important to know that for us, in order for these resources to be managed equitably and have a lasting development and security impact, fundamentally starts with local ownership. So we work very closely with local partners globally, but especially in Africa. These are our areas of work: regulatory and legal reform, supply chain transparency, illicit trade and financing. We just put out a big report on the role of India in illicit gold trade as links to Africa, gender equality, environmental stewardship. And we do them, I would say, transversally. So we do it in a comprehensive way. It's not usually standalone. So we're a fairly technical organization, sometimes very difficult to explain what we do to a common, regular audience. So we did do research as part of the GROW series, partnering with Carleton University and with an institute in Uganda called DRASPAC. And it focused on DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda, looking at the barriers and opportunities for women working artisanal mining, which we will explain shortly. And what was interesting, I'm just going to say, what really kind of surprised us, or what came out of it, was not just research for the sake of knowing, but the partnering with local partners and with local academics, and bringing that information back to the communities where we work, and going through essentially a validation process with the local community. Really, we saw this kind of transformation where men and women and local actors really took the research on board, rejected some things, validated some things, and then they themselves formulated policy recommendations, and we supported them to go to the Capitol and meet with decision makers. And that led to a whole series of other, I would say, steps in sensitization, the formation of an artisanal women minings association. They then essentially started a savings and credit loan, and we provided support around financial and business schools, financial literacy. And now they're essentially developing a peace building program for Eastern Congo based on these networks. So it's amazing what awareness and doing research with local partners, and for them owning that research and understanding the links to policy and empowering them to do that. It's been actually quite a journey, and we're still going forward with that, obviously. So I think we're going to change gears quite a lot. We're going to talk about the informal sector, so a very different perspective, and I'm going to turn it over to Patience.
Oh, okay, thank you. Right. I will talk about artisanal mining. I think it's important to provide an overview of the sector. As Joanne says, it is informal. I mean, it's largely informal. We have a few jurisdictions which are really making effort, to make artisanal mining organized and formal, but largely informal. It is an opportunity. It is an activity that provides economic opportunity for the rural poor, especially those that are unemployed. But in terms of how it really turns out, there's a lot of harsh working and living conditions among artisanal mining communities. It's usually associated with low yields and low income for the people that are engaged in artisanal mining. And also there's a lot of predatory actors among the actors that are engaged in artisanal mining. Like in our case, especially when we look at the conflict-affected areas like Congo, there's the prevalence of armed groups that are involved in the sector, criminal networks. There's also a lot of predatory lending, as well as sexual violence. I know a lot of communities that where young women are engaged in the sector or are associated with the sector because they are providing sexual services to the miners. ASM in itself is poverty driven as well as poverty alleviating, and it's in a lot of cases it is it exists alongside the large scale and industrial mining. Now, in terms of the figures concerning the sector, we're looking at about 40.5 million people working in the SM sector, supporting about 150 million people in over 80 countries in the global south. You may be surprised that about 90% of the global mining workforce is actually in ASM, and 15% of gold production, global gold production is from the ASM sector. And say 40 to 50% of the people involved in ASM are women, especially when we look at Africa. So it is a sector that is a lot of global significance, economic significance. It also provides employment to both men and women. Now, looking at the cobalt and low carbon technologies and how this relates to artisanal and small scale mining. So probably before I do that, I give a brief introduction about cobalt and its role in low carbon technologies. Cobalt is a metal. It is, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
yeah, okay, yeah.
You want me to go back?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, it is a metal. It's used in the lithium ion batteries. And we are all consumers of cobalt, the batteries and in our phones, the move to electric, mobility, electric car batteries, renewable energy storage, smartphone batteries, all these consume cobalt. So it is really a key element in the transition to low carbon economy. And how is ASM then involved in cobalt? In the Democratic Republic of Congo, most of the global cobalt reserves are located in DRC. It is estimated that DRC produces 60 to 70% of the world's cobalt. And of that, 20 to 30% of the cobalt is produced and mined by artisanal small-scale miners. So there's a chance that the phone that we are having, a proportion of the battery is actually coming out of, an ASM, an artisanal small-scale mining operation. And artisanal cobalt mining is one of the most important sources of income for the local people. So we have cobalt, we have an opportunity for the local people to engage in cobalt mining and gain a livelihood. Now, the situation and realities around cobalt mining and artisanal small-scale mining, while contributing to the low-carbon economy, ASM, as I said before, is largely informal and it lacks the regulation, and the working conditions are really bad, I mean, in most cases. But the key issues that really affect women, there's exposure to toxic metal contamination, poor safety and sanitation. The income is low, but it's much lower for women miners than for men. We're actually going to show you the data to confirm that. And also there's poor environmental management, air pollution, and this increases exposure to women who are involved in cobalt processing. And how do we then use the research and the data as impact to sort of mainstream the women economic empowerment in cobalt programming? So what we do have, research, baseline research. We also do some studies, and we generate a lot of data that informs our programming. And I'll just give a quick overview of some of the findings that we get and how then we use that data to inform our programming. An example is it relates to the average monthly income by gender. So in this particular cobalt community, you see that the women get 60% less income than men. And it's not only in cobalt, it's actually common even in gold and other mining where ASM is involved. Women are working in low pay areas. They actually are relegated, to screening of waste and waste sorting because the rich pockets are the preserve of male miners. So how do we design a program that could actually intervene and assist the women miners to gain more income? We provide equipment to increase the productivity of the women miners. We also provide training for the women in equipment maintenance and management. It's kind of skills training for the women miners. And also we do support the cooperatives that are led by women to be able to access the mining areas and have their own mining pits. Because we realize that women earn less because they do not have their own mining pits. But if they do have access to the resource, it actually provides them an opportunity to earn more and to gain more. And also, one of the key issues is that they lack equipment. They lack equipment capacity. They do lack the resources to buy equipment. And when a woman miner, for example, is in need of a piece of equipment, there are times that a male miner can even suggest that, look, for you to access my piece of equipment, I need to have sex with you, for example. So we try and break these limitations by capacitating the women miners.
And those figures are Congolese francs. Sorry, it says 50,000. Those are Congolese francs and not dollars, obviously.
Oh, okay.
So the average monthly income there is 65 Canadian dollars a month for the woman.
And then, of course, we also provide technical skills and the monitoring capacity for the women. We've noted that the women lack the technical skills, but they are the most environmentally exposed. They are the ones that are involved in cobalt washing, where the water reacts with the toxic metals, and it is the women that really are exposed, to that. And we've also noted that in gold mining, women are exposed to mercury vapor, which also has a great health impact among the women. So what do? We provide the training. We also provide productive equipment for the women. We are also planning in the cobalt project to provide handheld tools, for the women to be able to test the metal exposure in water and in air so that they can be proactive and prevent the exposure. And the other challenge that we've noted and trying to address is the access to credit. From this community, the data shows that, first of all, ASM access to credit is very poor. But when you're looking at women miners, it is 50% less than men. So in a subsector which has very limited access to credit, women are even much more worse. So with this knowledge, what we did, especially for the gold program, we implemented what we call artisanal mining, women's empowerment and credit and savings, AFECO. We do have a handout for that. And that project supported women in artisanal mining community to safely access credit and savings. And it was a huge success among the women. One of the experiences that we've had also to try and bridge the access to credit for women. When I was working in Mongolia, a women loan fund was established to fund women miners to be able to access equipment as well as economic empowerment projects. So this is how, as Impact, we use data to sort of inform our programming to be able to try and empower the women miners. Well, when it comes to bank ownership and financial inclusion, I think the graph speaks for itself. A lot needs to be done. So in terms of bank account ownership, women 0. For men, 3%, it's limited, but at least men do have access. So I think there's still a lot that has to be done in terms of financial inclusion and access for women to banking facilities. But we found an interesting sort of information regards mobile banking. With regards to mobile banking, well, it's not. It's not good news, but it's okay. For women, it's only 3%, and for men, it's 4%. In terms of having a mobile banking account. So we think that probably the mobile banking could provide an opportunity for increased financial inclusion for the women miners. We see that as an opportunity because there's no need for collateral. There's no need probably for financial history. So we are investing some resources to sort of understand more the impact of mobile banking for the women financial inclusion. Okay.
That was so interesting. I feel like I learned so much. That was really incredibly fascinating. And your mention of the Kimberley process in the beginning, I didn't know that it wasn't working as well or that anymore. Okay, so that's all absolutely new for me, which brings us actually quite nicely on to the next question. I've been very curious about a lot of these new kind of tools, technologies, market-based approaches, instruments, for example, corporate social responsibility, social and gender lens investing, carbon pricing, green bonds, green microfinance. How useful are these? What kinds of evidence? It's not something that I've researched, but I really want to know what kinds of evidence are they useful for the types of works that all of you on the panel are doing? And if so, then in what ways are they useful or not useful? If you could comment on, and please feel free to comment on those that may not be on this list too, because there could be others specific to mining, for example, that I don't know about. So I'm not going to, not everyone has to answer the question, but if you think that any of those new tools or instruments are interesting or useful, you want to take a crack at it, Laurent? Yeah.
Okay. Actually, was asking myself the same question because what I mean is in our project, there's two things. The first thing is what I've seen in our project in terms of microfinancing or trying to make some kind of green credit line. The main challenge in terms of energy efficiency intervention was that there's no collateral. And I mean, not because those people are poor, of course they are, but for almost any kind of energy efficiency interventions, there's no collateral because what you do, you create nothing. You just consume less. You see, so so that's the main challenge. So so what I can do is point to a challenge, and I have no solutions. Still not yet, unfortunately. And the other thing is that, as I said before, what we found in our project is that we need to, we know the solutions are to help women with energy, what we call energy justice solutions. But again, the main challenge is to how to facilitate women to, let me put it that way, enter the economy. The first dollar that a woman can make with productive activity, how do you make that? Because what we saw is that most of the time, a woman participate in all kinds of decisions within the households. Mm-hmm. But for some kind of reason, cultural, social reasons, they don't participate in the economy. If, again, they are responsible for collecting wood and biomass for cooking, but that doesn't mean that women are solely responsible for energy, because if it's gas or electricity, this is for men. And this is what I meant by entering the economy. So they can use wood and what they call wood energy, which means this is already collected wood in the market instead of collecting in the forest. It means that if they have improved cook stove, they will consume less solid fuel, they will have more spare time, and they will have more opportunity for productive activity. But again, this is the first step. This is the main challenge that we saw in our project.
Funny, specific to clean cooking, actually, we during my time at the IEA, you know, I looked at the reporting on the different Sustainable Development Goals, and the IEA is a custodian agency for the Sustainable Development Goal that relates to energy, obviously. And it's the one that's the slowest on track. We're nowhere near meeting the clean cooking goal, even when the others, you know, other access to energy is moving. And it's kind of interesting because to me, that tells you a lot about gender hierarchy within a household, right? Because in that, when resources are limited, I found this very clearly in my findings in India, that within a family, even women won't identify a clean cook stove as a need because it's something that is so low down on the list of priorities for a family, right? And you already have, even if it's the most inefficient way, even if there are horrible health consequences, you've done it forever. That's how you've always done it. So why would you switch your 3-stone you know, stove over to a clean technology, especially when it costs money, right? And when households are much more likely, i.e. often men who often hold much more power within households, to spend money on a different item that they see as benefiting the whole household, as opposed to just benefiting women in the kitchen, right? So there were cases where in rural India, you know, we can see households where in the living room, people have a TV, they have cell phones, they have even like a motorcycle, but in the kitchen, the woman is still using. So it's no longer actually even about poverty as much anymore. It's about the fact that women have so much less power within the household to be able to articulate what they need, that their needs often don't get on the hierarchy, right? So it's so important to understand that particular goal in clean cooking because it's so closely linked to like women cook. Therefore, this is a technology that's not going to get that much attention within the household energy hierarchy. And some things that, I mean, it's kind of a design fix, but it's interesting because I remember this being talked about at the Self-Employed Women's Association. One of the things they were recommending was that now a lot of cook stove models and lanterns, you can add a cell phone charger to it. So often they have to make a decision about where to put it. Do you put it in a solar lantern or do you put it in a cook stove? And my recommendation is always for a cook stove because it also gives that particular technology a leg up on the household power hierarchy, if that makes sense, right? Because then all of a sudden it becomes something that you can also charge your phone on, not just something that benefits women, even though, you know, the health consequences themselves are disastrous, right? We have millions of people dying, but so there are small opportunities sometimes I find for just technology and design to make a difference, I think, to also influence social hierarchies, that but they're limited. I completely agree, right?
Just let me just quickly, what we found in another project is that 100% of households with electricity were using solid fuel or gas cook stove. So there's no cooking with electricity, even though they have the money and they have access to electricity. So.
I actually looked into why for that. I can talk a little bit later about that, but I think it's called fuel stacking, right? Where people will use a range of fuels as opposed to just one that they're still using some of. And in some cases you kind of say, so be it, you know, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good, right? Like at least it's moving us forward towards, you know, cleaner technologies. So yeah, thank you. May I ask, I'll come back to you, Françoise, but may I ask if on the mining side, how are some of these new tools, technologies, are they useful?
Yeah, so I'm answering here in the context of, I think what's been written there as corporate social responsibility or related kind of market-based initiatives. And what is really on the rise, in light of the fact that certification schemes in particular are falling short, like the Kimberley process and other things, is private sector, we call it private sector due diligence, meaning you know where your product is coming from for the entire supply chain and can essentially attest that it is responsible depending on whatever standard or criteria you're using. And so, so in the context of, we call it supply chain due diligence or human rights due diligence. And this is about mining and artisanal mining, also large scale mining, but it's every commodity right now. This is what consumers are asking for more and more, especially millennials. The fashion industry, the financial sector, agriculture sector. We want to know if our products are produced and traded responsibly, so it's not doing harm, right? So a lot of it is about risk mitigation for the private sector. But given our experience in the Kimberley process and other certification schemes, there is a place for those things, but it's limited and some work better than others. But for us, it was really about how do you really know it's making a difference? Fair trade labels, I mean, fair trade is great, but how do you know at an individual level, especially a gender disaggregated level, whether it's actually leading to lasting change or supporting women's empowerment? Because fair trade is a certification scheme of cooperatives. So how do we know, like really? So everything we're doing, I would say the last 3-4 years, we've switched very much to making sure we're data and driven by the analysis, right? So that is informing our programming as Patience alluded to. So when I talk about supply chain due diligence and getting to the evidence, we really cut our teeth in what we call the Just Gold project, which was funded by the Government of Canada and still is, first kicked off in 2012. And it was really initially intended to prove that you can trace artisanal gold from one of the most difficult contexts, from pit all the way to consumer. And so there is now gold sold in Toronto by an ethical jeweler. You can buy a ring that is produced with a fully responsible supply chain of traced gold supporting, you know, development from Congo, from these communities. But what was interesting is in applying this, so we were testing this and we had private sector actors who were pulling it through the supply chain. There's different data groups that accompany that. So first is essentially the actual commodity. So the ore comes with data about the mineral itself, but also essentially trade data, right? Production and trade, so sales information, so you know whose hands it traded in, how much was paid, all that sort of thing along the supply chain, so you could trace the commodity. Due diligence, which is, you know, the next thing, is about the context. No child labor, no human rights violations, security, no corruption, all those things. That data also accompanies the commodity. And that is what you can find with the ring in Toronto if you buy it. But when we first started to really kind of layer over, you know, baseline information and collecting every 6 months to see whether or not we were having a development impact through responsible business conduct and responsible sourcing, what came out was that men's incomes were increasing, but not women's. In fact, the gender equity issue is becoming greater because of all the reasons that Patience was alluding to. A lot of the stuff that came out in the GROW research, that women are more and less remunerated parts of the supply chain. They're doing, you know, the secondary functions. They're working in isolation and not in associations. There are all sorts of things. They were being paid less for their ore, irrespective of the grade than men. All these type of things. So knowing that allowed us to course correct on the ground and quite radically change the situation. But it was really about the system as well, the data collecting system that I think we learned a lot from. So this is such a hot issue right now, due diligence and supply chains, that everybody's out scrambling to find information to prove that their company is responsible, this, that. There's just a plethora of tools and measurements, and everybody's claiming to be doing, you know, SDG and realizing number whatever and putting it on their marketing, you know, products. So what we really wanted to do is really have a robust approach to this without reinventing the wheel. So as I said, we were wanting to marry the supply chain information, those two kind of types of information, with development data. So we can really know if there was a link and if the impact ultimately was positive or negative. So what we did is we adapted internationally validated existing measurements for the SDGs that were applicable to the sector. So you always see these, you know, rankings of countries at the national or international level. You know, country X is number 116, country so-and-so is number 2. So they come, depending on the index, they come with questions, indicators, allowing that comparability. So what we've done is we've taken the appropriate indexes and SDGs, and for the last 2.5 years, we've been testing it, its applicability, localizing it, and testing it for the artisanal mining sector, and tweaking questions and making sure it works in order to have comparable data to the national level and the international level, and building off frameworks that are already validated and accepted by the development community. So for example, USAID has a Women's Economic Empowerment Index applicable to agriculture. We've adapted it to the artisanal mining sector. So we actually can compare apples to apples and talk about empowerment and not just income, which is actually quite problematic in the mining sector. So the question there, when you overlay the data, is how do we know we're making a difference? Rather than relying on a certification scheme, how do we know it's making a difference? How do we know it's making a difference for women in particular, who are the most marginalized most of the time in these contexts? Sorry, this is it's a bit really detailed and a bit overwhelming. What Patience just presented was our first baseline in cobalt, which, as he explained, is critical for the green economy. And what I just talked about, adapting kind of those national level indicators and indexes for the artisanal sector and localizing them, this is kind of what it looks like as a scorecard as part of the baseline. So it allows us to compare. You'll see columns on the left. So these are different dimensions: peace and security, environmental protection, social protection, gender equity, equitable livelihoods. And each of these have a number of SDGs kind of linked to them and relative indexes. So the columns on the left talk about the baseline value, that's at the project and community level, compared to a national benchmark, if there is a national benchmark. So we can see what's happening locally vis-a-vis how the country is scoring on these issues. So if we look at environmental protection, we can see, for example, where artisanal mining or large-scale mining for cobalt in the communities we work with, we see air quality is terrible compared to the national average. So it's the red dot. And then we have gender equity as well. We have a number of things like this that allow us to compare the project and local dimensions to the national level. We collect information every 6 months, and so we can know whether or not we're moving the dial on the SDGs in the right way. And this is an example of what we mean by, excuse me, actionable data. So this is for the gold sector, for the Just Gold project that I talked about, excuse me. So I referred to the USAID Women's Economic Empowerment Index for agriculture that we adapted for artisanal mining. So the way they measure it is through these different dimensions: assets, income, leadership, production, and time. So at the bottom are the different kind of data collection cycles. So 0, 1, 2, that's every 6 months as we're collecting. Again, in order to know if we're having a positive or negative impact. So assets, for example, relates to access to pits and equipment. And through the intervention, as I said, initially men were more favored than women. Through our intervention, some of the interventions that Patience was referring to, we see over time that assets, access to pits, equipment, et cetera, increased for women. This is strictly for women, obviously. And in terms of income, I talked about men's income being higher than women's initially. So that's the 0.00. After every data collection cycle, after we supported and worked with the cooperative and with the newly formed Women's Association to ensure that women were being paid the same as men for the same quality ore, to make sure that they're supporting them to organize themselves, essentially that kind of credit and savings work we were supporting. So this is kind of evidence of the kinds of intervention that lead to change, transformative change over time. But the outcome, or let's say the big learning out of this was for us, is that supply chain due diligence and corporate social responsibility in and of itself is not sufficient. It has to be a development approach that actually leverages the private sector and not the other way around. And at the moment, the discourse is that the private sector can do this and do development. But we see when we get granular level information push beyond certification, and now essentially for the types of minerals we need to feed the green economy, that we have to be looking much more closely at what's happening on a granular level and on a regular basis to know what's actually going on and who's benefiting. So that's it.
I think we're getting close to the end of our panel, but that was terrific. That was kind of what I was hoping you would present. Françoise, would you like to add any comments to that?
So maybe just to share with you what we are doing at GAC in this area. As I've said, we have these huge gaps when it comes to women's economic empowerment and gender equality. And so we talked about the gap in terms of skills, which is really a critical point. One of the initiatives I think which is really important is actually managed by IDRC but funded by GAC, is supporting women in STEM but at sub-group working on climate change. These are women scientists. And really, I think this is making a huge difference to have, you know, a group of scientists, young women across the continent, but supported not because we were talking about barriers. One of the key questions was why women are not interested in these STEMs. And believe me or not, the perception of young girls, young men, when it comes to STEMs or engineering studies, they see types of job that they will be offered, which sometimes are not really interesting from their perspective. So there was a huge effort to promote STEMs and to explain what would be the outcome. It's not just what you see, it's science, it's education, it's health, it's climate change, it's everything, and you can apply all those skills to every sector and then made a huge difference in terms of attracting women. So this is a very interesting program. I would really encourage other donors, even GAC, to do more on that front, because we are really creating a new generation of young feminists and leaders who are bringing skills and knowledge to the climate change, because when they are looking at those issues, nobody really is looking at. And as we've been saying, it took a generation of women involved in peace and security to say, excuse me, the fact that you are signing a peace agreement doesn't mean that you are responding to those issues. Absolutely. So they are bringing issues that nobody else is looking at. This is a good example of how we can really build the skills, strengthen women's skills, and find a solution. And from a continental point of view, this is a good investment. TVET, it's again an area of work we are supporting, which I think is having some issues when it comes to after the completion of education. But one of the examples I think I would like to share is GAC is supporting the transition between college to industries, bridging those skills and contacting entrepreneurs, and this again, offering them support and advocacy for women, because there is some misunderstanding why women are doing this TVET. This is not a job for girls. So again, when you have those gap and analysis, you need to find some specific, action and measures that will help you to reduce the barriers. Otherwise, nobody is looking. The last question, I think, issue, it's about agribusiness. I think, again, back to the Africa, 32% of GDP, comes from the agriculture, which is actually the biggest employer. But the way the agriculture is done is not maybe in a very sustainable way. Again, bringing the skills to this sector and bringing women's skills and investing in sectors that are really have been identified by women as the most valuable sector, where they can control the resources and go through the value chain model, making sure they have the total control from the farming to the market, which include accessing to finances and credits. This is something GAC is doing, and I think I cannot, I will spend a whole day just going through each project. That this is something that, again, confirm that we need gender-based analysis in everything we are doing. Otherwise, we are just reproducing inequalities, and we are not responding to the issues of climate change.
Thank you, Francois. I think that actually brings it back quite nicely to what I began with, which is that there are many sectors of the economy that are undergoing tremendous change as a result of transition to low carbon economies. And it's very important that more diverse people, beyond just talking about even gender, that the more diversity we bring into these sectors, the more chances that we'll find kind of sustainable solutions for common problems. So I think that piece is really, really important. And I think you brought it up very nicely in terms of more women and needing to be at the table in a variety of different fields. And I definitely feel that very strongly with research on climate change, for example, because when I look at the scientific evidence, even in the transition to low carbon economies, when you look at the research, most of it looks at the technology and looks at the financing, very little on the equity aspects of the work, right? So it's no wonder that, I feel as if often I feel quite hyper visible, because I feel as if there are so few people working on these areas that we hear the same voices, and we really need more people to join in different capacities, whether they're doing research or seeking employment in these fields. So I think we can wrap there. And is there time to take maybe a few comments?
There is not time. We have too much expertise on this panel to contain to 45 minutes. But what I will propose is, if those of you here in person have questions, if the panelists happen to be sticking around, I'm not sure that they can, come chat, have a discussion. And those online, if you have specific questions for any one of the panelists, you can email it to me. And I can perhaps forward it to them to give you a response. So I think there's other ways we can connect. Before we go, I'm going to just mention that a recording of this seminar and all the related resources. So Françoise, you mentioned the GAC-funded IDRC work on women in STEM. I'm going to find that. I'm going to put it on our, oh, perfect. I will put it on our website as a related resource for this seminar. I'm going to get the material from Impact and put it on there. The recording of the seminar, the PowerPoint, everything will be on our website within the next couple of days. So look forward to that. And I'm going to throw it to Sonia really quickly, Sonia Laszlo, our WED Lab program lead, for a few words before I close us out.
Thanks, Kate. So first of all, thank you all for a really very interesting and fascinating talk that I think has left a lot of questions in our minds of directions to follow and notes for future research ideas. So thank you all very much. I just wanted to take a minute just to reflect on the fact that this is our last of this seminar series. We are unfortunately coming to the end of a wonderful 3-year adventure with IDRC on helping to promote some of the research coming out of the GROW, but more broadly on women's empowerment in developing countries. This particular seminar series has also been funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and what we've tried to do in this these last 12 months is to really, bring to a public discourse the state of the art in our knowledge and understanding of what's happening in promoting women's empowerment. And it's been, for me, on a personal level and professional level, a very rewarding experience to be able to engage with brilliant minds as facilitators, panelists, and audience, really bringing together the worlds of academia, policy, and practice to be able to engage in this. So even though we are taking a hiatus, the materials are going to be available on these websites. We are not abandoning this. We're hoping that there will be more opportunities in the future to, we're like a volcano. We're just going to go dormant for a little while, but we'll erupt again. I do want to, of course, in addition to thanking our sponsors, IDRC and SSHRC, and of course, McGill University, I do also want to extend a very deep appreciation to the people who've been deeply connected with this SSHRC Connection Grant, which has funded this series. Our collaborators, Bipasha, one of them, Jillian Dowie from IDRC, who's currently in Delhi, Rebecca Thiessen from Ottawa U, my colleague Franck Rimard at McGill, Katie Fallon at Sunnybrook in New York State, and Elisar Saru from CIDAP here in Ottawa. And of course, I'm going to get into tears here, but I want to thank Kate Grantham for all of the fantastic work she has done. We've been working closely for the last 3 years, and it's been a real 3 years. It's been a real treat. And so I know, given the dormancy stage of this, we won't be working as closely, but hopefully we will continue to work in the future. But please, thank you. None of this, all of this is Kate. So thank you. She's all the success and is Kate. So so thank you very much, Kate. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. That's so nice. I certainly would never take all the credit. This is such a collaborative effort, this seminar series in particular. So 2 other people at IDRC I just want to thank, Mylène Bordelot and Martin Lefay. They, on the technical side of organizing these events and helping me with Zoom, which I'm horrible at, they have been instrumental to actually facilitating these seminars, so really special thanks to them. And thank you to our panel, Patience, Joanne, Bipasha, Francoise, Laurent. Thank you so much again for your time and expertise. It's been wonderful chatting with you. That's it for us. All right, bye-bye.